in fact recalled based on the survivors of the Liberty getting the word out that it was actually Israelis attacking them. The plan had been to blame this on the Egyptians and nuke the Russian facilities in Egypt, just destroy Egypt, sort of the way we've destroyed Iraq now, in order to give Nasser a setback. Nasser was a very popular, militant, anti-colonial Arab leader at the time who was in bed with the Russians. So, we almost nuked Cairo in 1967, according to Peter Hunem's book, Operation Cyanide. We'll have a Q&A after. Next slide. Operation Gladio was a terror operation run by NATO under U.S. command in which thousands of European civilians were massacred by agents of the state. And these crimes, these bombings and shootings, were blamed on leftists. Why would the Pentagon organize such an operation through its NATO allies? Well, the purpose, as participants in it have explained, was to terrorize people and force them to run to the state for protection, and specifically to make them run away from the leftists who they were about to elect into power and run into the arms of the right-wing forces that were supported by the U.S. So it was a way to stop the socialists from winning elections, basically. And probably the worst event was the Bologna train bombing, which killed 85 and wounded over 200. And this is all discussed at length by Daniel Gantzer in his book, NATO's Secret Armies. The European Parliament has admitted that all this happened, and they somehow stopped short of going after the responsible parties and prosecuting them. And in fact, they never were even able to get any assurance that Operation Gladio has ever been terminated. Next slide. In 1990, once again, we had war trigger incidents and lies leading to war. The White House showed the Saudis doctored photos supposedly showing Iraqi forces massed on the border of Saudi Arabia, ready to invade the peninsula. The Saudis panicked and allowed the Americans to enter into that war through Saudi Arabia, which was a real affront to many of the Muslims of that region who have a kind of cultural belief that non-Muslims shouldn't be running around in this sacred territory, which led to all sorts of trouble. Next slide. And Gulf War I was also launched by this amazing PR hoax in which the Kuwaiti ambassador's daughter, who hadn't even been back to Kuwait for a long time, is basically an American-raised girl, went before the Congress and testified that she was a nurse in a Kuwaiti hospital, which of course she wasn't, who had witnessed these Iraqi soldiers ripping babies from their incubators and throwing them on the cold, hard floors to die. And tears trickled down her cheeks as she said this, and the tears trickled down the cheeks of the Congress people, and the resolution to allow Bush to go to war with Iraq passed. It probably wouldn't have without this. Turns out she was coached in her performance by Hill and Knowlton, a Bush family-linked PR firm. Next slide. In 1993, we had the first World Trade Center bombing in which it appeared to have been organized by the FBI informant. He did all of the logistics and convinced the people to go along with it. And then we have the FBI informant on tape discussing with his FBI handler the fact that the FBI apparently built that bomb. They were supposed to give him a dud, and he's on tape arguing with his FBI contact about why they wanted to use a real bomb when they had originally said they were just going to use a dud. Oklahoma City. If you look at the early news reports out of Oklahoma City, you see officials removing unexploded bombs from the Murray building that had just been half destroyed. There's a study by General Pardon that proves that the amount and extent of damage is not remotely possible to be blamed on a truck bomb full of fertilizer. Instead, this was a military operation using military bombs. Next slide. Okay, so we've established the fact that false flag attacks and war trigger events are probably fairly common, although we may never know the absolute truth about many of them. Is there anything else in the context of 9/11 to make us suspicious? Well, there was all sorts of apparent foreknowledge that indicates these people all knew it was coming. I'll just pick a couple of the really interesting ones. David Shippers, the man who prosecuted Bill Clinton's impeachment, was approached by a group of FBI agents before 9/11 who told him that they knew that there was a huge attack coming up, and they knew the date and the target, and they tried to stop it, and they were rebuffed by their superiors. In fact, they were threatened by their superiors, so they went to Shippers. Shippers went to his friend, Attorney General Ashcroft, and called him up and was repeatedly rebuffed. So he gave up, and 9/11 happened. He wasn't too happy about it, and he went public with this. Randy Glass, an FBI operative involved in investigating Pakistani arms trading up to and including supposed nuclear weapons. He was apparently involved in investigating the Pakistani AQ Khan nuclear ring that was brought down after 9/11. Learned that the World Trade Center was going to be destroyed in early 2001. And he tried to poke around and look into it and find out more about it and wanted to stop it. He approached a Democratic senator from Florida, Graham, repeatedly, over and over and over, to try to get something done about it. Graham being on the Armed Services Committee, he had no luck. Well, finally, somebody gave him the number of Francis X. Taylor, a high-placed Colin Powell protege in the State Department. And according to Glass's testimony, which in everything else has been considered reliable by our mainstream media, which has had him on repeatedly, he called up Francis X. Taylor's private phone number, and the first thing Taylor said to him was, "Randy, we already know about the planes that are going to hit the Twin Towers." And what was odd about that was that at that point, Glass knew that the World Trade Center was slated for destruction, but he didn't know that airplanes had anything to do with it. Francis X. Taylor went on to say, you must not talk about this with any of your colleagues. You know, we are walking in a nuclear minefield now. You just have to absolutely shut up. So he was silenced, and then he felt very bad about this after 9/11, and he went public. So these are just a few of the evidence, pieces of evidence of foreknowledge. Among the most interesting, though, to me, are the fact that the Iraq and Afghan wars were planned before 9/11. In fact, they were pretty much set in stone. Yet they would have been completely politically unfeasible back in that strange old pre-9/11 world that most of you probably can barely remember. Likewise, the Patriot Act and the NSA spying program were drafted, and in the case of the NSA spying program, actually implemented before 9/11. And then after 9/11, they were made public, and they were blamed on 9/11. Next slide. Well, George Orwell famously has a line that the only freedom that matters is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that freedom is granted, all else follows. Well, here we have 2 wars that were going to happen. Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill tells us that Bush and his cronies had already rubber-stamped the Iraq invasion in the first month that Bush was in office. And they already had carved up Iraq's oil fields and divvied them up among the oil majors. We have the testimony about the Berlin Conference between the U.S. and Afghanistan in July 2001, in which the U.S. negotiators told the Taliban leaders that either you will accept our carpet of gold or we will roll out a carpet of bombs. And the Taliban refused to give the pipeline contract to Unocal, the U.S. favorite, and continue to offer it to the Argentinian company Bridas. And the next thing you know, we have this war being slated for October. And there were U.S. military people being mobilized for the Afghan war in August of 2001. The war then, of course, happened on schedule in October, but it wouldn't have been possible without 9/11. So, yeah, we have all of this stuff that couldn't have happened without 9/11, and yet it was all set in stone before 9/11, wheeled out on cue afterwards. That should make us very suspicious. One last question here, which one that really goes to my heart, is why won't they debate us? That is to say, why isn't there a real debate about any of this? And why won't those who would argue against much of what I have said tonight step forward and debate me in a public forum? It's really hard to find anybody willing to stand up for the official version of any of this. And we've tried. In 2006, when I was all over the media after being hounded by right-wing Republican state legislators for being a conspiracy professor who said nasty things like this on the radio, the History Club at the University of Wisconsin-Madison canvassed all of the relevant departments in hopes of setting up a debate. They tried the history department, they tried the poli-sci department, they tried sociology, they tried everything. They couldn't find a single professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison who was willing to defend the official version of 9/11 or the 9/11 Commission report in a public debate. So I ended up debating empty chairs. The same thing happened then a little later, the next winter, at the University of Michigan, where Kevin Ryan, the Underwriters Labs whistleblower, and I were hoping to debate some professors there. And more than 1,000 invitations were issued, and DVDs were actually given along with the invitations to professors, including the entire engineering program. Not one was willing to participate. Not one was willing to defend the official version of any of this. The only response that the organizers got was from a couple of different engineering professors. And in both cases, the professors said, well, of course it was controlled demolition, but we can't say that in public or we will lose our jobs or our funding. So this is the question that I've been raising with the Academy. Where are the people who are actually willing to defend their side in this obviously critically important debate? And if any of you can help drum some up, I'll take them on the radio, if nothing else. I have managed to find a few, and I'll tell you, it's even those people, the most prestigious independent scientist who has questioned the sorts of arguments that I'm making here. A Canadian named Dr. Frank Greening originally was by far the most cited scientist by 9/11 debunkers on the internet. And with time, he has moved closer and closer and closer to our camp. Most recently, after the NIST report on Building 7, he stepped forward and said this is complete nonsense. This is the only independent scientist who's seriously attempted to defend the official version of what happened to the Trade Center. And even he says that the NIST report on 7 is total nonsense. So finding anyone to argue nonsense is really hard. And I guess the reason for that is pretty self-explanatory. Next. Okay, so given all of this, the historical importance of the fact that 9/11 was yet another of these false flag operations should be pretty obvious. You know, for one thing, these wars are still going on. Our country is going broke. We've lost our Constitution. And then even if you forget all of that, in future history, they're going to keep doing this until we stop them. What about the next war and the one after that? You know, what about the Iranians that are going to be framed for attacking us, leading to perhaps World War III as the Russians or the Chinese step behind the Iranians? You know, who knows? We really need to put a stop to this kind of false flag war trigger terrorism. And if we do, it's going to be a lot harder for the warmongers to launch these kinds of wars in the future. So how are we going to do this? Well, we clearly have an uphill PR battle. We're fighting against a lot of vested interests that are afraid of what might happen if this information becomes fully public and fully acknowledged by all of the authorities. And I think that a lot of those people are not really evil traitors or apologists for mass murder, which in a sense, of course, they are. But that's not how they see it. From their perspective, which is, all perspectives have to be entertained as legitimate until proven otherwise. From their perspective, this revelation of the truth about 9/11 and false flag terror in general would be so destabilizing that some terrible things could happen. They're afraid of what might happen if the truth came out. Would we have a revolution? Would peasants with pitchforks and torches storm the White House? Would we have a French Revolution situation where people were beheaded? Alan Sabrowski, a recent guest on my radio show, has caused all sorts of mayhem in the truth movement. And by mayhem, I just mean very passionate arguments. By saying that he really is afraid that if the truth that the Israeli Mossad was the key player comes out, that this could lead to pogroms or maybe another Holocaust, and certainly the end of Israel and great suffering. He's expressed these fears, the same fears that were expressed much in a more low-key way by my co-editor of 9/11 and Empire Volume 2, Sandra Lubarsky. She's a Jewish studies professor in Arizona, and her essay is a gem in which she very touchingly entertains this, her own fear. It discusses and analyzes her own fear that if this does turn out to have a lot of Israeli involvement, what this could mean for Jewish people. So that's another of the kinds of fears that people have